This Sunday we have Fred Bahnson speaking about ground and what it means to walk the ground, to be grounded, and aware of the way in which God has created us and where there is wisdom found in the ground. He is the director of food, faith, and religious leadership at Wake Forest University, which is a part of the Divinity School there, a fine Divinity School. He's the author of two very important theological books. Most recently, this is the one that Noah has, Soil Sacrament, which is a really intellectually stimulating, but just as importantly, a beautifully written book. I commend it to all of you. Fred, we know Fred's friends, which is the only way we got him here. Fred is friends with Noah Campbell. Noah, in addition to going to church here, his day job is directing something called the Memphis Center for Food and Faith, a really interesting nonprofit on Vance that's doing some fine work. And we are jointly bringing Fred to Memphis. He spoke last night for the center, and he is with us at GSL this morning. Please give him a warm welcome to the Rector School. My informal introduction is Fred is a mystic who grows shiitake mushrooms. True, in both senses. Welcome, Fred.
Thanks.
It could be easier.
Okay, great. Good morning. I would say I'm an aspiring mystic. I haven't quite gotten there. But I do grow shiitake and oyster mushrooms. And I brought Noah some. And my wife and I'm going to just move this thing up while we're talking here. Well, maybe not. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Those of you in the back? Up? More? Good, okay. It's great to be with you, and thanks to Noah and all of you for bringing me here. My friend Lauren Winter was here last week. I'm really glad you got to hear her. She's a wonderful speaker and writer, and it's great to follow in her footsteps. I'm gonna launch right in and give a talk and a short reading, and then open it up to you for discussion. I want to begin by saying that I think the ground, not the mountaintop, is a fitting metaphor for the spiritual life. I think we have operated for too long with this assumption that the spiritual life is an ascent, that God is somehow up there, and that we need to climb to get to God. We talk too much of reaching our peak, striving for the top. We think God is up in the sky. Jesus may have been transfigured on a mountain, but he didn't stay there. His ministry was lived down on the ground. Jesus, when he performed his miracles, he didn't use magic superpowers to zap stuff. Right? He used the material of creation that was already on hand. He used water, clay, saliva, bread, wine, the stuff of this world to perform his miracles and to work his ministry. When he fed the 5,000, Jesus didn't create food out of thin air. He used 2 loaves and 5 fish that were already on hand, and he multiplied them. So what I'm talking about here is that we don't need transcendence so much, I think, as we need eminence. We need to bring our spiritual lives down to earth, where all of us live. The ground is often, as I said, where we find Jesus. And I love that image of Jesus crouching in the dirt, scribbling a few words on the ground. To stay grounded is to stay low, to be humble. Humility is related to the word humus, soil. We are not spiritual brains floating 5 feet above the earth. We are bodies created from the earth. Inspired by the breath of God, yes, but also of the earth. When Ash Wednesday comes here in a few weeks, we'll tell each other that from dust you were created, to dust you will return. In the 2nd chapter of Genesis, we learned that we were created Adam from Adamah, human from humus. And that's our first etymological clue as to just how much we are part of the earth. The Oxford English Dictionary is a great tool. I won a writing contest about 6 or 7 years ago, and I got $1,000 for this essay that I wrote. And I was really excited about that, and I thought as a good sort of long-term planning measure, I would reinvest that in my writing, and so I shelled out $800 for a full Oxford English Dictionary, all 20 volumes, all 5 feet of it on the bookshelf. And I said it's a wonderful resource, and in the 8 years that I've owned it, I think I've opened it like 3 times. But it looks really good on my shelf, I have to say. But when I was thinking about ground, Noah assigned me this word, and I'm glad that he did. It's a perfect theme for my talk. But I said, well, I need to look up this word ground because it has a long history. And I found 8 pages worth of stuff in the Oxford English Dictionary. And so I'm going to spend the rest of my talk just reading from the Oxford English Dictionary. No. One thing that I found interesting was Evelyn Underhill, who was a real mystic, said this. She said, the point of contact between a person's life and the divine life is called the ground of the soul. The foundational or basal stuff whence springs all life. It's the point of contact between God and the soul, the ground. So when we talk about the ground, we're talking about getting down to the real nitty-gritty, where life really happens. In my own journey, I went to Divinity School in the late 90s and read a good bit of theology. And when I finished Divinity School, I was kind of frustrated because a lot of that theology I'd read seemed to happen up here. Karl Barth is a beautiful theologian, beautiful writing, but a lot of it, if you've read Barth, a lot of it's just it's pretty heady stuff. And I was looking for something more kind of rooted. And my journey led me to read some of the agrarian writers, people like Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson, and people who were farming, who were working the land, who were connected with animals and plants and soil. And I began to find there a very rich understanding of the spiritual life. I ended up going to Chiapas, Mexico, and working with a group of Mayan coffee farmers. A few years later, having caught this kind of agrarian vision working with them, I came back determined to learn how to grow food and feed people. That was my calling, my vocation. And I helped start a community garden for a little Methodist church down in Cedar Grove, North Carolina. And that was a wonderful sort of theology of the ground 101, you might say. I learned firsthand what an immanent, rooted discipleship life looks like by living among folks who were growing food. When those 4 years were up, I wanted to find other people who were living a grounded spiritual life like this. And so I set out on a journey to meet them. I went to visit 4 different agrarian faith communities. And I spent about a week in each place. And each visit coincided with a season and a liturgical holiday. And that's really what my book is about. It's called Soil Sacrament, and it's about my own journey from Chiapas to this community garden, and then later my journey to these 4 different agrarian faith communities. And it's really a collection of stories about people who are trying to live a grounded, rooted spirituality. And that's not to say that you have to be a gardener or a farmer to live that way. But it just so happens that the act of growing food really does root you in a profound way in the earth and in participating in the sources of our nourishment. So I want to talk to you about one of those communities in particular, this place called Mebkin Abbey. It's a Trappist monastery. Has anybody ever been to a Trappist Cistercian monastery? 1 or 2. Okay, great. Well, has anybody read Thomas Merton? Yeah, good. About half of you. Well, Merton was a Trappist monk, one of the best spiritual writers of the 20th century. And Mebken Abbey was this sort of offshoot of his Abbey Gethsemane. And the monks there at Mebken raise mushrooms. They raise shiitake and oyster mushrooms for their livelihood. And as I spent a week with these guys, and they were guys, most of them in their 70s or 80s or 90s. My choir mate, Brother Gregory, was 92. Most of these guys pretty much spend their day working and praying. The Benedictine ideal is ora et labora, prayer and work. And they start their day at 3 a.m. and get up to pray vigils, and then they go out and work in their mushroom shed to earn their livelihood and come back throughout the day to pray and then go back to work. And it's a wonderful rhythm. And I want to read you a little section of that where I describe the mushrooms. This takes place, as I'm writing this takes place about 4 in the morning as I'm sitting in my monastic cell contemplating the mysteries of mushrooms. My mind traveled past the Abbey Church, across the fields to a cluster of sheds, where millions of tiny threads of mycelium worked in the darkness. A string-like network of fungal cells, mycelium is the organism that produces mushrooms. The brothers cultivate mycelium, whose fruit, the mushrooms, supports their life of prayer. This relationship with fungi to life as we know it, I skipped a sentence. This relationship with fungi was relatively new for them. They had taken up mushroom cultivation after many years in the egg business. But the relationship to fungi to life as we know it goes back nearly 450 million years. Indeed, without mycelium, there would be no life at all. And just think of mycelium and fungi as synonymous here. Without mycelium, there would be no life. Only recently have we come to understand the true magnitude of our dependence on these organisms. We now know, for instance, that at least 90% of all plants on Earth form a symbiotic relationship with a fungus called mycorrhizae. The Greek word for fungus root. Mycorrhizae are ubiquitous, found in nearly every ecosystem in the world. So just this unseen network of fungi permeates all of animate life and feeds it. Indeed, life depends on it. The relationship works like this. The fungus penetrates a plant's roots and provides the plant with nutrients and water from the surrounding soil, which the fungus accesses through its mycelial network. The fungus, in turn, receives starches from the plant. When mycelium grows out into the surrounding soil, it is said to run. And in so doing, it not only forms symbiotic relationships with single plants, it provides links between plant species. And if the science is getting too boring here, I promise there's not a lot of it. If your eyes are glazing over. But listen to this. In 1964, 2 North Carolina scientists chopped down a red maple tree and poured radioactive liquid into the stump. 8 days later, they found that within a radius of 22 feet, the leaves of nearly half of all the trees, shrubs, vines, and herbs contained radioactivity. Mycelium provided the pathway through which the radioactive material spread between these species. This experiment confirmed fungi's link to every living thing and every dead thing. Fungi are our biological go-betweens to the world beyond animate life. And like monks at prayer, they do their best work in the darkness. I knew something of the benefits of early morning darkness. Back home on winter mornings, I had lately been rising at 6 a.m. I would fire up the wood stove, set the kettle on top, and for the 30 minutes it took the water to boil, I would try to pray. But my mind wandered easily. I got bored. Many mornings when the kettle boiled, I would awake from a fire-tranced stupor, my thoughts far from God. Despite my lifelong faith, I'd arrived at age 38 only to realize that I didn't know the first thing about prayer. In his book, The Conferences, 5th century writer John Cassian described prayer as an uncontrollable grasping fire. The only fire I knew was the one burning in front of me in the wood stove while a clear day dawned. When I did manage to actually pray, I often became trapped in litanies of petitions, pleas for forgiveness, or cesspools of self-recrimination for past wrongs. My prayer repertoire was limited to the just wanna prayer. You all know the just wanna prayer? Lord, I just want to thank you. Lord, I just want to ask you. Jesus, I just want to. I grew up evangelical, and that's how we prayed. I just want to. You have to sort of preface all your prayers with that. It shows your earnestness. But prayer is not simply a matter of technique. The monk's way of life is not about learning to pray for just a few hours a day. It's about turning one's entire life toward God. Some viewed such life as escapist, yet that was a misunderstanding. As Father Kevin, one of the monks, put it, monasteries do not exist to say the world is bad, let's hide. They exist because in order to go deeper into the heart of God, we have to let go of other things that are constantly calling our attention. Far from leaving our bodies behind, prayer leads us to engage more fully with them. For God cannot be separated from the things of this world. I sought a life of prayer lived in intimacy not only with God, but also with the land and with a community of fellow pilgrims. That was why I came to the Trappists. They were known for a life of ora et labora, prayer and manual labor. So I spent about a week working with these monks. Learning about how mycelium and fungi are part of this life of prayer. Learning about the life of the body and the life of the spirit. One of the monks that I worked with, Brother Dismas, he was a young monk. He joined the monastery at age 17. He was, I think, 22 when I met him. And Dismas and I were hoisting mushroom columns one day. To grow oyster mushrooms, they take these big 5-foot-long plastic tubes about that big around, and they pack them full of cottonseed hulls and wheat chaff that have been boiled, and they inoculate it with the mushroom spores, and they pack it in there, and then they cut holes in the bags, and they hang the bags up. The bags weigh about 80 pounds. Hang the bags up, let them sit for a couple weeks, and then the mycelium runs all through the substrate and eventually starts to produce mushrooms. And it's hard physical work, and they do this every morning, Monday through Saturday. And one day I was working with Brother Dismas, and I said, Dismas, why'd you come to the monastery? And he said, and by the way, Dismas was the name that Catholic tradition assigned to the good thief on the cross beside Jesus. And that was the name that he had taken as a monk. And Dismas said, I studied academic theology at Notre Dame for 4 years, and my faith was all from here up. It was all from the head up. And he said, I came to the monastery because I wanted to learn to put the faith in my hands. He said, I wanted to learn how to live an embodied faith, where not just my mind was at work, but my body also. And he said, some spiritual questions can't be worked out intellectually. They have to be worked out with your body. Dismas, a few months after I left, Dismas left the monastery for good. And I talked to him on the phone and learned the story. And he said, after 7 years, I realized that I was struggling with celibacy. And he realized he didn't want to live a life of celibacy. And the way that he let his brothers know that, he gathered them all, in their chapter meeting. There are about 20 brothers, and they're all sitting in a circle. And you can imagine, 3 or 4 guys in their 70s, and the rest are in their 80s and 90s. And then there's Dismas. and they're all gathered in this room, and the monk council. And Dismas said, I want to take a brunette out for coffee. I want to take a brunette out for coffee. That's how he described his leaving. And the brothers, gave him their blessing. And after the meeting, one of the older monks, Brother Vincent, came up well into his 80s, and he put a firm hand on Dismas' shoulder, and he said, "Dismas, for God's sake, don't limit yourself to brunettes." Don't limit yourself to brunettes. I just love monks. One of the monks I got to be friends with that week was a monk named Brother Robert. And the Trappists wear these long white robes with a black, I think it's called a scapula or a cowl. I always get those mixed up. Anybody know? The black piece that goes in front of the white piece. Any liturgists help me out here? Anyway, black and white robes. Well, in the wintertime, they throw on some heavier robes over that. But Brother Robert just sort of refused to wear those. He said that chafed his arms. And so he went about in sub-zero weather in just this thin sort of cotton monk robe and wouldn't wear any socks. And he was this sort of semi-feral, sort of semi-wild guy. And he told me stories about living out in the woods on retreat for days at a time. He would build these little shanties out in the woods. Or he even built tree stands and tree forts. They lived along the Cooper River, and he would build these landings, these jetties out onto the river with a little patched together lawn chair out there. And he would go to these retreats. And that was for him a grounded way of meeting God, just going out sort of barefoot into the woods with nothing but a prayer book and some bread and some water. So I was really intrigued by this guy because he seemed kind of one of those ancient holy men with a lot of wisdom to share. And I want to read a section from when I met Robert. So as I said, Robert had built all these landings out in the woods, and Mebken Abbey has 3,100 acres of land along the Cooper River. It was a former estate owned by Henry Luce and Claire Booth Luce. Luce being the publishing magnate from Time and Life magazine, and Claire Booth Luce, his wife, was a Catholic, and they left this estate, this piece of land, to the monks. It's a beautiful piece of land along the Cooper River, just north of Charleston. And so Robert handed me these maps of all these little prayer landings, these tree forts and cobbled together jetties and little shacks out in the woods. And I set off to go find them. And so I'll read you a little section from that. And I think this will tie back into our theme of ground and of listening for God's presence. Robert told me I should look for a special overlook along the river, several miles south of the monastery. It was beautiful there, and along the way I might even see an old rice boiler from the plantation days. He smiled and handed me the clutch of maps as a gift, and then shook my hand like a well-wisher seeing off a friend on a long voyage. He wished he could accompany me, he said, but he was confident I could find my own way. The way was not immediately apparent. I tried to take a shortcut behind the monastery and follow a tangled trail beside the old rice fields, but I ended up hacking through greenbrier and spiky palmetto palms. Soon I was cut up and bruised. A barred owl hooted above me in a dead oak tree, which I took as a sign, and I turned around. Backtracking, I found the way that I should have followed at first. The first field I came to was named St. Joseph's, leased to a neighboring farmer who planted it in cotton. At the edge of the field stood a massive live oak, and up in the crotch and the trunk I could see a wooden platform. Though this was not the overlook Brother Robert steered me toward, I climbed up, dropped into an old rusty lawn chair, and began to pray. As a boy growing up in Montana, I used to hunt from a tree stand. I would sit with bow and arrow until long after dusk, waiting for a big buck to emerge from the thicket below. It was a contemplative kind of pursuit, a sort of active waiting. The deer may or may not emerge, but you waited with full expectation that it would until eventually the waiting became an end in itself. When I was 16, my father, brother, and I traveled to northernmost Quebec to bow hunt. South of Ungava Bay, up near the Arctic Circle, I killed 2 caribou. But that was different. I was hunting in a group, and there were so many caribou migrating across the lake that it would have been difficult for my arrow not to hit one. In all the years sitting alone in tree stands, I never shot a deer. And yet those hunts are some of my most memorable. I understand now that I was not really after deer. Sitting high up in a stand of aspens or perched in a big maple between 2 alfalfa fields, my body swaying with the trees in the cold breeze of an October evening, I was like Elijah in his cave on Mount Horeb, waiting for God to pass by. God would come to me then across the vastness of the fields, and I would suddenly be enveloped. My teenage worries would vanish, and for long stretches, 15 minutes, 45 minutes, I would lose myself. I would simply be. Resting in God, the monks call it, and the hunting I found most conducive to such rest was from a tree stand. Perhaps that's why Brother Robert had built so many of them in Mepkin's woods. Scrambling back down, I took a dirt road bisecting St. Joseph's Field that led me through fields of cotton. On either side of the road, I began to see mushrooms, first 1 or 2 and then whole patches of them. They looked like parasols, or perhaps the poisonous destroying angel mushroom. All of the mushrooms were on the side of the road, none of them out in the cotton fields. This was a conventional cotton field, and the fertilizers had replaced the nutrients that fungi had once supplied to the plant's ancestors. For fungi to flourish, the soil must remain undisturbed. Plowing destroys mycelium. Yet all around St. Joseph's Field, the undisturbed woods were undergirded and fed by the fungal web, invisible strands connecting field and forest. I left St. Joseph's, passed through a short stretch of pine and live oak, and emerged at St. Anne's Field, where I discovered another tree stand. This one looked too tidy to be one of Robert's. His were always cobbled together with old wire and bits of scrap wood and tires and stuff. But this one looked almost new. I climbed up for a look and sat down, and without even meaning to, again, found myself praying. I would need to return to the Abbey soon to keep my appointment with Father Kevin, my spiritual advisor for the week. But it was such a restful place that I lingered. Why rush off and talk about my prayer life when I was experiencing God's presence here and now? As I sat and thought about why I'd come to Mepkin, I realized that despite these solitary moments in the trees or beside the river, the connection with God that I sought could not be sustained in retreat from the world. I did not, after all, really want to escape the messiness of human life. I wanted to embrace it. I wanted to claim my role as a co-creator with God of the earthly city. And that meant claiming my place in the human family with all of its frailties and frustrations. I was no hermit. I didn't find the overlook Robert had recommended that day, but I discovered something else. The realization that I didn't need to escape to Mepkin to find my own little prayer landing. I had one back home. The spiritual ecology of prayer always includes such places of withdrawal, landings, tree stands, a chair by the wood stove, a porch swing, unadorned places where your soul can touch down for a little while and simply be. It is in such silent emptiness that God is waiting. Here there is no need to plow the air with constant chatter. Let the mind's field lie fallow, such places tell us. Let the mycelial strands of prayer run in the darkness and see what fruit may come. And when you leave, those same strands will follow under your feet, undergirding everything that you do. I'm going to stop there and take your questions. I want everybody to do this. Take 1 minute, turn to one person and say one thing that struck you about something that I said. 1 minute, one person, one thing. Go. Okay, finish that thought, and then who wants to share a thought? Comment, question? It's Geraldo Rivera time. Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
I had the privilege of spending a week with Philip Newell on Iona this fall, and what immediately hit me as you were talking was the similarity to Celtic spirituality and the embodiment there with the earth and with the groundedness of their prayers and their whole spirituality of God so immanent rather than just in the ether. And that is so powerful and so inviting to me. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'm not well versed in Celtic spirituality. I need to read more, but I do know a little of the ideas of the thin places. I'm sure you all are familiar with that phrase. A thin place is somewhere where God's presence becomes somehow more, we apprehend God's presence more easily than in other places. And I felt that these landings, these cobbled together jetties and rickety old tree houses 40 feet up in the trees, these were thin places. And perhaps just from monks like Brother Robert, just going there week after week, decade after decade, it's kind of one of those places that God shows up. And that's certainly true with Celtic spirituality. Yeah.
I want to share an experience that I had when I visited the Kamatolis monastery in Big Sur. And I never forget when I got up early in the morning and I went to the kitchen, because you do your own thing there, and got some cereal and milk. And I went, the sale had a little patio, that you share with the mountains. And all of a sudden, this little red fox came up. And he just looked at me, so I said, okay. So I gave him some cereal. He ate it, looked at me, and left. And that was awesome, because that really was being, with God.
Yeah.
That was so cool.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Noah.
Can you talk a little bit about,
Okay.
I'll project. Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which your ministry with the growing of food and the sharing of food is an expression of that groundedness,
Yeah.
and that connection? Maybe you're talking, starting in Chiapas or just in Anathoth, North Carolina.
Yeah. How did everybody hear that? How growing of food and sharing of food is a example of grounded spirituality. In Chiapas, Mexico, I had a very direct experience of being fed, living among a group of poor coffee farmers, indigenous Mayan Catholic coffee farmers. These folks didn't have a whole lot, but they took me in and welcomed me as part of the family. And time again, just eating simple meals of beans and tortillas and eggs from their chickens, some jalapenos that they grew. Just these very simple meals, being fed in that way really sort of opened my eyes to how connected our eating is to our desire to be fed spiritually, and how impoverished our American way of eating is. Whether it's fast food or the fact that so many of us eat alone, the fact that much of our diet is coming from these big industrial farms that we know nothing about. We don't know how those animals were raised or what kind of chemicals were sprayed on our food or how the workers were paid who harvested our tomatoes. All of that stuff, it's this big disconnect. And it's to our loss, I think, that we don't know that. And in Chiapas, I had this very immediate, tangible experience of this food coming from the land all around us, made by the hands of Angelina, my friend Jose's wife. Jose grew the corn and the beans. Angelina made the tortillas and the beans. It was this very immediate connection. And so that was my first kind of tangible experience, and that led to me helping start this community garden and giving that experience to others, of teaching them to grow food, growing food together, having bi-weekly potlucks. And I think that kind of hunger to return to a more rooted food life, this larger food movement, is a spiritual desire. We've experienced this vast cultural disconnect since, I'd say, the end of World War II with the rise of industrial agriculture. We've been eating in ignorance. We've been eating cheap food that just sort of magically appears on the shelf, and we don't know where it comes from, and we're sort of eating in ignorance. And so I think this food movement, farmers markets, the rise of CSA farms, food hubs, all those kind of things, I think, are coming out of this deeper spiritual desire to live a more grounded, rooted life. Thanks for that good question. And Noah is one of the guys doing that work right here in Memphis. You need to get to know him and his work if you don't already. Yes, ma'am.
Growing up in the rural South, we have grown up very close to the woods and nature,
Yeah.
and food sources and growing food and production of everything, of all of that. Do you think that's part of why the rural South is also known as the Bible Belt? Do you think our connection is...
That's an interesting observation, that the rural South is known as the Bible Belt because we are surrounded by nature, perhaps in a way that big cities aren't. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I think I tend to agree with that. Yeah, we're much more integrated with the land around us. Yeah, yes, ma'am.
I want you to go back to when you were talking about prayer and that your prayers consisted of a lot of petitions. So what does it practically look like? How did you move out of your head in prayer, and how does that relate to your work with food? Faith.
How do you move out of your head in prayer, and how does that relate to my work growing food? That's a great question. For me, I've been rediscovering or discovering for the first time the monastic writers, the early Christian monks of the deserts of Egypt, the desert fathers and mothers. Right now I'm reading a lot of this guy, St. Isaac of Syria, a 6th century monk who got conscripted to be a bishop for 6 months, and then he just couldn't take it, and he had to flee to the desert again. But a lot of these early monastic writers writing about prayer, they talk about not focusing on these thoughts that come. I mean, we have constant thoughts that flow through our minds. I've heard one writer talk about the cocktail party that's always going on in your head. all these different voices chattering away. And so the trick is not to latch on to any one of those, just let them flow through. And meanwhile, what helps is to repeat a word or a phrase that centers your thoughts on God. And the centering prayer tradition, is picking one word: mercy, love, Jesus, and just repeating that. And the Eastern tradition, it's a phrase. It's called the Jesus prayer, and they pray it over and over. And it goes like this: Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you can do it inhaling: Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. Exhale. You can shorten it: Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy. But that's kind of the basic prayer, and that's the one I've found most helpful. And the idea with the monks, what the monks say is that it becomes, you repeat it over and over, it's in your head, but eventually it makes its way into your heart. And you begin praying from the heart. And you begin experiencing God's presence and just resting in God's presence, they say. And I'm a total novice in this, so I can't tell you much more than that. Other than it seems to be working. To me, it's a way I find I can pray without getting trapped in just this kind of endless asking for stuff kind of program that I grew up. That's how I learned to pray growing up, is that you sort of just ask God for stuff, right? And I sort of found that lacking. How does that relate to what we've been talking about? I think I find getting out and working, using my body, is a wonderful way to pray. And the monks, they don't distinguish. They don't say that we're praying in chapel, but when we're doing dishes, we're working. I mean, doing dishes can be an act of prayer. So it's, I think, having a kind of phrase or a repetition that you keep coming back to, you can find yourself just praying throughout the day rather than having to set a certain time. Thanks for that question. Yeah, two guys in the back.
That's also one other form of being grounded.
Uh-huh.
You have something in your heart, and you make every moment, as much as you can, make it sacred by being in that moment instead of thinking there'll be a time.
Right.
That keeps you grounded.
Right. Yeah, and I think having that time in the morning, if I can do it, I find it helps me also pray throughout the day. But it doesn't have to be an either or. I think of them as a both and. Yes?
I think that you briefly touched upon community gardening and urban agriculture and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
How could we as a church sort of tap into the spirituality of that, and how could we use community gardening and involvement in urban agriculture to fulfill our obligations as Christians?
Great question. Yeah. So in our experience, in my experience doing this community garden for a little tiny Methodist church in a very rural part of the North Carolina Piedmont, what we found is that people are hungry for this kind of embodied communal life, sharing meals together, growing food together, sharing lives together outside of the workplace and outside of church. And a garden is just a wonderful locus for that to happen. It's a wonderful place where a lot of different communal things can happen. And so I think there's great value in churches starting community gardens. It doesn't have to be a massive affair. It can be, as big as this room. And it's not so much the quantity of food that you'll produce in this place, though you could produce a lot of food on a plot this size. But less important than how many tons of food you crank out is the community that gets built there. And so to me, what I saw in my 4 years at Anathoth Garden was that it's a whole new way to be a church. You're doing church, you're just doing it out in the garden. And we would think of ways to bring the church's liturgical life out into the garden. Pastor Grace, this was a Methodist church, but she was much more kind of Episcopalian in her style. She insisted on weekly Eucharist, which is kind of un-Methodist. She had a very rich liturgical sensibility, and we would celebrate Eucharist right out in the garden beds. We would, on a Saturday work morning, we would go out and stop right in the middle of work. 10:30 in the morning, everything's going great. Right at the peak of the morning, we would stop once a month in the summer and we'd celebrate Eucharist. And then we would, during Sunday morning church services, we would bring the gifts of the garden to the altar to be blessed. And so it just starts making those connections that the Lord's Supper is not just something that happens with a little wafer and a sip of wine, but it's part of this richer life that we're now sharing together and eating together. All that's to say, I think as much as the church can kind of get outside the walls and do those kind of projects out in the community, I think you'll find that you're doing it not so much for others as you're doing it for yourself too. There's a lot of benefits that come back. So thanks for that question. So I think I'm going to offer a short blessing to send you on your way, and then we'll go to Eucharist. So let's pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks that you are the ground of our being. I pray a blessing on all those here, that you would continue to mold and shape us into the kind of people you want us to be. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you all for having me.